It's always startling. All right, let's go ahead and start.
Do we press? Okay.
All right, we'll give it a few moments while folks log in. Get some info in the chat here. Okay, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica from Greenlight and we are so thrilled to host tonight's panel on writing desire with acclaimed authors Lynn Steger Strong, Leilani, and Miranda Popkey. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to these amazing authors and to the team at Picador for helping us pull all of this together, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces right now, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. A couple little housekeeping things before we start. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you. There are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by one of the authors, please post that question in the Q&A. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions just from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And very importantly, tonight's featured books, which you'll hear more about in a moment, are available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person at our bookstore locations 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Lynn's, Raven's, and Miranda's books and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat again in a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying one of tonight's featured books, or all three of them, is a great way to show your support. All right, I'm going to do some super short introductions in the order of publication of these three brand new paperback books. So starting with Miranda Popkey, she has a BA in Humanities from Yale and an MFA in Creative Writing from Washington University in St. Louis. She's written for, among other outlets, The New Republic, The Paris Review Daily, The Hairpin, The All, GQ, and New York Magazine's The Cut. Her debut novel, Topics of Conversation, was published in paperback this March. Composed almost exclusively of conversations between women, the stories they tell each other and the stories they tell themselves, the book covers 20 years in the life of an unnamed narrator hungry for experience and bent on upending her life. Leilani's work has been published in Granta, the Yale Review, McSweeney's Quarterly Concern, Conjunctions, The Cut, and the New England Review, among other publications. Leilani received her MFA from NYU and was an Axon Foundation writer-in-residence. Her debut novel, Luster, was published in paperback in June, so it's fun to be hosting her again to talk about this book. Irresistibly unruly and strikingly beautiful, razor-sharp and slyly comic, sexually charged and utterly absorbing, Luster is a portrait of a young woman trying to make sense of her life, her hunger, her anger in a tumultuous era. And Lynn Steger Strong's first novel, Hold Still, was published in 2016. Her nonfiction has appeared in the Paris Review, Guernica, Larb, Literary Hub, and elsewhere. She teaches writing at Catapult and Columbia University. Her novel, Want, was published in paperback in July, actually just this Tuesday of this week. Grappling with motherhood, economic anxiety, rage, and the limits of language, Want is a fiercely personal novel that vibrates with anger, insight, and love. So I want to hear, hopefully, each of you can first take a second to talk to us a little bit about your own work, and then we're going to sort of have a conversation all together, and then we'll be taking some questions from the audience. So we can start with Lynn. Your book literally, the title is Want, so desire is clearly front and center. So can you talk a little bit about who's doing the wanting in this book, and how is it animated by desire?
I mean, I think hopefully everybody's doing the wanting. And one of the reasons that, not just because I didn't want to be kind of an asshole, that I wanted this to be about desire and not want, is because I think they're different. And one of the things I really admired about these other books is the way that they, I think, also are interested in the ways that they're different, which is just to say that, like, part of what want is about is all the different manifestations of want, but then all the different ramifications for wanting. And I think too, like, how understanding, and again, I think this is why I love these other two books so much, especially when one is female, understanding one's relationship to want separate from the systems under which one lives feels nearly impossible. And I think the word desire feels like something that's more visceral to me than want, and maybe more sort of yeah, more visceral and less sort of informed by systems. And so want, I think, was engaging with a person who maybe didn't have a lot of access to desire, or wasn't able to sort of find her way into access points for desire. Although, on a more fundamental level, it was maybe the thing she wanted most of all. Even as the book is also about these more straightforward, like she wants to feed her family, she wants to be safe, she wants all of these things. Um, I think the ways that those things are both the same idea and different is one of the things that want is about.
And Raven, your book also is described in that short little description that I read in terms of hunger, in terms of your protagonist's hunger. So can you talk about in what ways desire or hunger or want is central to Lester?
Absolutely. I think like the project when I started writing this book was I wanted to write about that desire in art and like the sort of form it takes on the page of wanting to make a thing and coming up against your own limits, but also that the way the body expresses it and sort of the way those social structures color the way you're allowed to express it and perhaps even how it's perceived. So when I started writing Edie, it was so important that she be a person where you could feel her id, because I think as a Black woman moving through the world, like she's sort of involved in a number of performances that are meant to keep her safe, and I wanted to write toward that reality of that sort of friction between that self-protection that is necessary to keep yourself alive, but also the way that can preclude the kind of human connection, carnal expression that I think is sort of inherent to being human or to being a person who is experiencing a full or allowed to experience a full kind of range of desire. And there are moments that that mandate of performance kind of dampens her ability to express in total what she feels, but I wanted to write away from that as much as I could. And there's so much I could say around my own my own jealousy of like being a real person in the world and writing this into the fiction, and wanting that sort of mobility for myself even. But a huge part of the project was allowing her writing away from respectability, the idea that that good behavior might kind of earn her the right to empathy, writing toward unruliness, writing toward fallibility, which are intertwined, I think, with the expression of the carnal.
And Miranda, for you, in topics of conversation, obviously again that word hungry comes up in that description. In what way is desire sort of the animating spirit of the conversations between women that are at the heart of topics of conversation?
Yeah, I sort of want to pick up a thread from what Raven said. The character's id. I think something that is really challenging for my unnamed narrator is she has a real difficulty telling the difference between, or she has a real question about whether there is a difference between sort of what she wants, quote unquote, naturally, and what desires have been instilled, have been trained in her by the process of socialization that happens when you are, when you are socialized as a woman. There are certain models of desire, there are certain models of friendship and romantic relationships that are front and center. And you are, of course, always, or this was true for me growing up, I was always looking for models that would tell me how to be in the world. And when all of those models are presenting a certain kind of desire, and are presenting a certain kind of woman who wants a certain kind of thing in a certain kind of way, you can come to desire that. And I think the situation that my narrator is in is that she has these desires. They feel very natural, they feel instinctive, but they are also in some sense quite foreign to her, and quite foreign to her her idea of herself, to her politics, to her sense of herself. And that for me was really what animated the novel. How can you tell what is really yours? And if something isn't really yours, but it's really stuck in there, what do you do about that? Is there any way to train yourself? And is there any value in training yourself to want something different?
Wow, this is a lot already. And I feel like one of the things that was occurring to me is like, we talk about this as being a discussion about writing and desire, but how, to what degree is this specifically about women's desires? And to what degree is that necessary because of the specific ways that women's desires are policed or understood or misunderstood? And, you know, whether those are like sexual, physical desires or desires to create or other kinds of desires. What is specifically sort of female about desire and about the way that each of you is writing about desire?
I feel like both these ladies just sort of, in what both of you were saying, what the word that I kept thinking was the conditions upon which one is allowed to want to begin with. And the idea, I think, in both of these novels, like even what Miranda was describing, and this idea of unruliness in Raven's book, like the idea that prior to wanting, one has to be wanted, feels so much a part of the particular task of being a woman, right? And I feel like that's what I admired about both of these books in terms of like, well, fuck that, right? But like, and yet there are consequences, right? Like, so to not sort of, because femininity is so much embedded in an objectivity that precedes one's ability to be a subject, right? And so that idea of like making things or wanting things or feeling something visceral and then acting on it. I mean, one of the things that I constantly kind of reject about when you go to graduate school or whatever, and people tell you how to be a writer, is they say, well, what does a character want and what are they afraid of? And it's like, well, who said that I'm creating a character who anybody cares what they want and what they're afraid of? You know, and I think in both of these novels, and I hope to some extent in mine, part of what I think these books did really excitingly to me was press on a form that presupposes that these characters can pursue what they want, right? And understands that before these characters can pursue what they want, they feel like in some way they have to earn the right to want. And to me, at least, that feels very female. I don't know about you all.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm going to like leave this event and still be thinking about that idea of needing to have been wanted, or having understanding that desire of being acted upon you in order to understand that sort of interior desire. Because I don't think I would have ever phrased it that way, but it's really hitting me. And I think that question has a kind of interesting distortion when you are like writing about like a Black American woman who is like, every space that she occupies, you feel a kind of, you feel that she is, or she feels that she is, and kind of understands implicitly that she's moving through spaces in which she is not wanted. And that is not necessarily even just the romantic spaces, it's the professional space, it's the public fate spaces. And the part of the project of the book was the fuck that, right? That, like you said, was an attempt to kind of to create that, to sustain that without that precursor, because that precursor is weighted with with hundreds of years of history, but also what Miranda was talking about, that conditioning, and trying to figure out how to tease apart your I don't know, true, honest, those are really authentic, those are really horrible words, they mean so many different things, but how to tease apart what has been what you've been conditioned to want versus what you want in your sort of most honest and sort of unvarnished form. And in some cases, and what interests me are those moments where they kind of do intersect, the moments where it's messy. Because even like in the talking about this book, is if you put art into the world and you understand it differently based on the conversations you have around it. And that has definitely happened with this book. So in writing toward what is like the desire that is inherently female, and like I always want to make room for, you know, that to exist outside of the binary. But if we are talking about that, you always come up against desire. What is the desire that is sort of inherently male? And often it is that sort of masculine idea is brutal and violent. And in my book, it was a really, really tricky thing to write still toward that, and sort of still try and cast it as an honest, sort of feminine desire for annihilation. It was a really kind of tricky kind of line to walk that I'm still, like, even in this moment, trying to figure out how to articulate. But I do think that the answer is that it is, there is enormous amount of overlap. There's enormous amount of overlap, and those learned behaviors do become, they become a part of you. They become a part of your language. And what's interesting to me is writing toward that gray area.
Yeah.
Well, just to say about your book, though, it ends on creation, which is one of my favorite things. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful, there's many things, but like that it ends on creation. A book about a woman who seeks annihilation and ends on creation is a very beautiful thing. Miranda, I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was also, to pick up on one of the threads that Raven was playing with, those gray areas. I think one of the things that makes those gray areas so electric to sort of touch, so powerful, is that if you ever do manage to access a kind of desire that feels not totally written over by whatever sort of process of socialization you've been subjected to. And I think for the narrators of all three of for the narrators of our three, or the main characters of our three books, it's slightly different processes. You know, my novel is very much about, you know, a white woman of a certain social class and of a certain educational background. You know, Lynn, your novel is very much about someone who has children, someone who is a mother. Raven, obviously, your novel is about like a Black American woman. And I think when you get to that gray place and you're able to like put your finger on something that feels like it's your own, or feels like it's the protagonist's own, it's such a thrilling moment, and also such a moment of terror to be so vulnerable, to expose to the world the desire that has not been pre-chewed, that has not been fed to you, that is not being modeled elsewhere. And I'll just to circle all the way back around then to what Lynn was saying, like, it is such a powerful thing to end your novel, Raven, on this note of creation, because that is one of those desires that, you know, she maybe hasn't seen modeled, and she's like, yeah, no, exactly, fuck it, like, I'm going towards the thing that feels like it's going to be that's mine.
Yes.
That's so amazing. I want to say, before I forget, just to remind folks that if you have questions for the authors, to go ahead and drop them in the Q&A, and we will get to those before the end of the event. It doesn't need to be just me asking questions. And if the three of you have questions to ask to each other, like, please feel free to jump in. I did want to ask a question. I feel like about that moment of creation, but also about this sense of how difficult it is to know what one truly, honestly desires, and how connected that sort of exploration, or that difficulty in sort of identifying, is with the writing itself. And so the way that writing about desire is connected with the exploration of desire. I mean, and maybe it's a craft question, like, do you start out being like, I know my novel is going to look like this and it's going to end here? Or is there a sort of like feeling your way forward that's similar to the exploration of desire that you're actually writing about? I'm not sure if that makes sense as a question.
I mean, I think it always feels very, because I mean, it's a craft, you practice it, and there is, I think like the best prose feels extremely deliberate, as I feel like, both of, the authors I'm here with, like those books feel like that. But there is an aspect of craft always that feels, God, I'm sorry, I'm gonna be very like woo-woo, but like that feels kind of spiritual. It feels like something that you receive. And then in that way, it feels like reproductive. And so that too is, I think, tethered to the desire that kind of emerges on the page, is that at least when I'm writing, it is fully about discovery. It's about sort of writing toward what literally feels good. And that is a really scary thing. Is kind of a scary prospect, is that, Miranda was saying about the kind of the vulnerability involved in sort of putting down on the page your kind of conception of what desire is, of what feels good, of what feels bad. And I forget who said this to me, but I think about it all the time, which is that it's sort of kind of an easier thing to talk about desire in the kind of talk about desire and disgust. It's a harder thing to talk about what feels good, and for me that is a harder thing. But as I'm writing, that is sort of always when it feels good and when it's working, that's what I'm writing toward. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with like the concrete idea of desire, but in the work and writing, it's there. I'm writing toward a feeling. And that does, you do, I think, when you operate like that, you do kind of expose your neck.
If you're honest about what it is that you want, or if you put on the page something that to you feels good, it's an opportunity. I mean, this is a terrible way to look at it. There are many ways to look at it. It's a terrible way to look at it, but it's my instinctive reaction is, well, then someone can take it away from you. As soon as you show the world what it is that you value, the world is, then they know exactly how to hurt you.
Yes.
That's a bummer of a note. So I'll say on the question of on the question of craft, like one of the I think I also, despite that, move in the direction of sort of what feels good. I do a lot of, this is why I write very slowly and have a lot of trouble sort of writing the messy first draft that I think you have to write. I've been told a million times, and eventually I will learn, or maybe I won't, but it's really hard to put a sentence on the page that doesn't feel good. So I'm constantly like, putting a bunch of words down and then being like, it's not quite right. And then like delete. Yeah.
100% the same.
Yeah.
100% the same. I kind of want to believe that it's okay to stay like that forever, because I don't know how to do it any differently. But I just wanted to say, ditto. It is extremely frustrating. It makes the writing very slow, but it is because it is sort of driven by that, by your ears almost. It's like you kind of, when you're listening to something, to music, I feel like, I personally, because I don't know the technical components, but you kind of can feel when a note is just like a hair, like not where it should be. And that is always that's always sort of where I am, it gets stuck, and I kind of can't move forward until the note feels is the word that keeps popping up, until it feels like in tune.
Yeah, I think about it sometimes like when I'm talking like I'm about to make an analogy, and who knows, but like when you're like tapping on a wall to try and find the stud,
Yes.
so you can hang something. Like I'm talking like I've done this. Like I've watched it. I wouldn't know a stud if I knocked into one. But it feels like that. This is hollow. This is hollow.
Yes.
And then like you hit solid something, and you're like, oh, okay, this is the place.
Yeah.
Just to throw another metaphor into the mix, because that's what we need here. I feel like mine, and another word that's maybe the same word as feeling, but the thing I always tell myself is that it's like it's you have to hit the frequency that feels like pressing on a bruise. You know,
Yes.
that it's like the sort of, so first every book you have to find the bruise, and then you have to sort of press in that very specific way that like it's the right frequency, and then if the frequency gets off. I mean, I do feel like, especially because Miranda and I, like, I'm more willing to write messy sentences, I think, than Miranda, at least. And but I think that frequency has to be right. And then the knowledge of circling, like, I feel like so much to me is circling and circling and circling until you get in that sort of, I read this kind of extraordinary Henry James quote a couple of days ago about, now I'm going to get it wrong, but like this sort of still and silence amidst the chaos of the words, right? And just like sort of like, I feel like I write so many sentences that circle, and then I like get there, and then all of those other sentences go away, and I've got the frequency, and so I can keep going, you know? And I think like that is, it always feels like it's the frequency thing, you know, which I think the bruise is connected to the truth, which is, again, all of these words feel totally made up at this point, but like, I do feel like we're talking about the same thing, which is, and to Miranda's point, like, especially as like, in whatever way you define yourself, or whatever way you have a relationship to being female, the world is hurling so much dead language at you, and that you really are kind of, you're really, you've got to like dig through, right? And to some extent, that's what the circling feels like. It's like, nope, that's someone else's. Nope, that's someone else's. Nope, that's actually interesting. Stay there, you know? And then you fall off and start over and blah, blah.
I'm grateful that you said, and then you fall off, because
Right. And and you walk your dog, which you're, yeah.
Oh my gosh, you're all breaking my heart and blowing my mind with these metaphors. I'm just like writing them all. So I feel like something that's come up a couple times is sort of all of the systems, the sort of intersecting terrible systems that inhibit desire or that overdefine desire, that there's sort of a struggle within or against. And I wondered if we could talk about sort of the economic aspects of those systems. I feel like there's an element, I mean, as well as the sort of gender and sexuality systems, I mean, how those intersect with economic systems in your work itself, but also in your work as a writer, thinking about creating the art, finding the frequency that you want to write, but also needing to create a thing to be sold. And I feel like all of us who work in sort of like cultural spaces have to navigate that the weirdness of that system. That's like, this is how we all make our living, and yet there and yet. So if you want to talk about that, either within your work itself, or you know, as someone doing the work, I'd love to hear about you talk about economics.
I will say, so I think that my novel is the one that deals least, so sort of least interestingly with economics. So like in the work itself. So I'll sort of let Raven and Lynn speak to the economies of their novels, which I think are both really interesting to talk about. But I'll say for myself as a writer, I do think it's important to say, like, I do not make my living as a writer. I could not. I write very slow. I am constantly missing deadlines. I like, you know, I'm bad at pitching. I have no follow, like, I could not make my living as a writer. I work at a nonprofit. So, and I also, like, I'm married to someone who also brings in a second income. And that I also like, I don't live in New York. I live outside of Boston, which is basically just as expensive, except they're none of the good things. So I don't know what we're doing. But I think it is, you know, I don't know a ton about each of your sort of economic situations, but I think it is important, especially for a writer who is starting out, to hear people honestly talk about, like, because sometimes it's like someone is making a living from their writing, and that's amazing. But sometimes it's just family money, or sometimes it's you married a corporate lawyer, or sometimes it's, you know, it's a variety of things. Sometimes it's you work a day job, and that's, you know, that's my situation.
So, I mean, I also like really appreciate when there is like transparency around like, and really that was a core project of the book of like, what are the sort of like kind of financials that that determine who gets to do the art. And I actually do write full-time right now, but it's a very new development. But when I wrote Luster, and you know, every kind of year before that, I had a full-time job. I had a very traditional 9 to 5. I worked in publishing, and when I wrote Luster, I was also in grad school. So would come home and like everything I'd ever written, be it the sort of short stories that I was writing before I, you know, arrived at Leicester, or I'd actually written like 2 separate books before I got to Leicester that I like, each one, like every time you finish a project, you're like, this is the one. Neither were the one. But for all of those projects, that the work was happening after work. Like there was even a moment when I lived in DC where I needed a little extra cash, and so I worked for Postmates for delivery service. And so like I would get out of work, and then I would start the second job, and then I would come home, and there would be like a holy like couple of hours between like 9 and 11 that were the writing hours, and that was how it got done. And when you're in that moment, it feels, because the writing is so slow, it feels frustrating. It feels deeply frustrating, and it's hard to separate those conditions from like your own idea of your kind of personal capability, even if you are rationally aware of like the real kind of life conditions that are keeping you from literally being able to sit down and write. You have to do a lot of emotional work to kind of remind yourself of that. And as I was writing, that was very much the case, and it absolutely made it into the prose where like I wrote it in kind of a frantic state, because I wanted it to come out so badly, and I wanted to come out quickly, but my life would not sort of allow that. And so I had a lot of fear and a lot of even anger that sort of made it into the page and into the story around Edie's sort of pursuit of art. Because in her story, both her kind of emotional engagement and engagement with her art are dampened by the work she has to do to survive. And I had, you know, you look around and you have sort of models of who are doing the work you want to do, and you don't find transparency, or you have the idea of sort of a tidy artistic trajectory. Like it's very, very hard not to compare, like I think in the arts. And I wanted to write away from that. I wanted to write about a trajectory that halts, and that has a kind of a number of detours. I wanted to write about a trajectory where it isn't always the 9 to 5 that's getting in the way, it's you're getting in your own way. And speaking more to like desire, I wanted to write, like a question I get a lot about the book is, how come she doesn't have any friends? And I think it could be me as like an introverted author writing perhaps a character who has maybe a bad personality, but like it's possible. It's possible too that I like the work that you have to do to survive, like the work you have to do to get the money to pay the rent and to pay Sally Mae, praise the bandwidth you have for like emotional engagement, romantic or otherwise. And I wanted to write toward that reality, the sort of alienation, isolation that you feel when you're both trying to do the work to eat and trying to do the work that will feed your soul, the sort of create, in Edie's case, and in some cases, in my case, the creative work that you're desperate to do, but that you can't do because you're exhausted. Like I felt it was important to sort of puncture the idea that it is romantic to be working from a place of exhaustion, because I do think that our culture is really invested in that productivity, and it's very grim and it's dehumanizing. So that is sort of like my where I was working from when I was writing the book, and what the ideas I was trying to get out as I wrote.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things I really admire about Luster, and that I feel like I actively didn't do because of my own shit, is that the character is explicitly not a writer, and it was really important to me that she not be a writer, because I was like, well, if she's a writer, it's her own fault. She's broke. So if she's an academic, which, by the way, to be clear, is like, I make most of my living by being a teacher and et cetera. And so that was also, but like, to my mind, it was like, I want to make a book about money, and I also want to make a book where someone has made choices, and it's complicated. It was one of my very specific goals, that this character never feel like a victim. But I wasn't quite willing to make her an artist, probably for the same reason that I have complicated relationship to still taking every job I'm ever offered, because like, I want to make sure that I'm providing for my family in a clear way. I want to be, like, I really only let myself work very early in the morning before my kids are awake, because that's not time that I have to pay for, and that's not time I'm taking away from them. And that is still, I mean, to Raven's point, to both these points about sort of like getting in our own way, right? We still get in our own way, and then we get in our own way again with these other narratives about what's valuable, right? And if I'm making something that's not feeding my family, is it valuable? I don't, and again, like, I wrote all of one. I could have made the character a writer. I sort of joked on the internet, we're going to talk more about not autofiction, but I could have made the character a writer, but I didn't make the character a writer because I wanted it to be about the systems, and I didn't want it to be, and this is my language, about her, what I tell myself a lot of the time, absurd desire to be a writer, right? Like, I still feel a lot of the time when I am up at 4:00 in the morning, what am I doing? I'm going to be cranky all day. I'm going to be mean to the children. You know what I mean? Like, I will be a better mother if I didn't want to be a writer. And number one, that's not true, right? Because exactly what Raven's saying, it feeds something inside of me that is elemental to who I am, but I feel uncomfortable even saying that out loud, because I feel like I shouldn't, but it does. And it makes me a more fed and whole human. And that's a good thing. But it is hard to convince yourself of that on a regular basis. And it gets harder as it gets harder as the demands on your time and your life and your schedule get bigger. But I think back to that idea of like the frequency, and even what Raven was saying about like writing, I wrote Want really, really fast. And I wrote Want at a point where I was like, okay, you get one more shot because this is enough. Like, everybody's tired. You're tired. The kids are tired. Your husband, everybody's tired, and you can't afford any more childcare. So go, right? And I wrote it really, really fast. But also, I think it's important to say, I wrote it on the backs of a couple of failed novels, right? So like, I'd been writing for a long time. So that energy and frequency had finally come, and I let myself do it. I feel like I've lost the thread. Anyways, I think money, number one, I wish it was talked about more in fiction generally. Like, I feel like there's so much fiction I read and I'm like, okay, but what's the plan? Like, what's the plan? And then also in publishing, it's, like, I had a friend or an acquaintance whose partner made a lot of money, who told me when they got their line edits, they were doing their edits for a novel, and they said, well, I decided to quit my job this year because I want to make great work. And to make great work, I want to devote my brain fully. And I went home and cried, because I was like, I'm never going to make great work, because I'm never going to not be like, I'm always going to have a job, and that's a strange space to inhabit with regard to, I mean, talk about desire around creation. I have a lot of desire around creation, but to create, you need time, and time's expensive,
Yes.
Okay, we're starting to get some really interesting audience questions. So I'm going to pull a couple of these. You mentioned autofiction, so we'll do this one. Rachel Krantz is asking, how do you write fiction freely and let your characters go wherever you want them to let them be as imperfect as you want, when you know that so many readers will assume it's autofiction? How have you made your peace with people making assumptions that you are your protagonist? And she adds, this happens especially to women, I think. Anyone want to tackle that?
I feel like I get a lot of, I'll do the auto fiction. I'll start the auto fiction question. um, I, I think to this idea of like, I think the messy imperfections are the most interesting part. And so I think I'm always starting from this. I mean, if there's anything true in want, it's the sort of prickly, wobbly spaces that the narrator enters into at the level of psychology, right? Because that's what I think is most interesting about fiction, right? Is you enter those prickly, wobbly spaces because most humans enter those prickly, wobbly spaces. And so I think I'm honestly like probably in a way that's not, I don't know, ethical or moral or whatever. Like I'm most interested in the gross, weird, imperfect, uncomfortable, strange things that I see in the world. And I think it does feel like my skin feels prickly, you know, when they happen, when I hear someone say something and I'm like, you know, like, or my brain says something and I'm like, right. Like, then I'm like, oh, that should go somewhere, you know, that's that feeling or that frequency we were talking about earlier. So I think I'm most interested in those spaces. And I think I'm most interested in sort of jumping off of all of those cliffs in fiction. And then I'm interested in revision of thinking about a thing I say to students a lot, and they get sort of upset and then they come back around, is that characters aren't people, right? But they are tools of your fiction. And if you think of your characters as tools, think about who and what you'd be willing to use as a tool, right? Like, what would you be willing to say out loud at a party? Oh, I took this character and I used them as a tool. And think about how hard you have to work to not feel like an asshole for doing that, right? So like the tool in my last book was a tool that looks particularly like me, right? She was a white woman, a downwardly mobile white woman in her 30s who lived in Brooklyn and had 2 kids. My mother-in-law really wished she had 2 boys because I have 2 girls and she has 2 girls, but there was stuff about femininity. Anyways, so the container looked like me, but to me, that's not the part that I'm sort of abashed of when I'm writing. The part that I'm abashed of when I'm writing is those sort of prickly, wobbly things that character or lots of other characters in the book, because I made them all up, think or feel or say or do, right? Like that's the part that feels vulnerable to Miranda's point, and that's the part that's interesting and hard. The fact that the container looked like me was because that was the tool that best served the story and experience I wanted to portray. I don't know. I don't know if that answered. Somebody help me out, and then maybe I'll.
Yeah, I mean, like it was the only way I could think to write it, was to sort of inhabit those sort of gray, fallible spaces like that. I mean, I don't want necessarily to wade into like the likability discourse, which is like does not need anyone to like perpetuate it, I suppose, but like that is the only kind of like that's the only kind of prose and art that interests me and that excites me, are, you know, is art that makes room for those sort of kind of spiky contradictions. And it's hard to hold because I understand like the comfort of an absolute, but I really writing a deeply flawed Black woman, as I am deeply flawed and who is prone to mistakes as I am. There obviously was a certain amount that I drew from what I saw, and I think that like that is just that's what we do. And there's so much of like my DNA in it in terms of like, because I write toward my preoccupations, I write toward the things I am most fixated on, and so there is I very rarely have much distance from the subject that I'm writing about, because I have to write toward what most excites me, what most moves me, and what is most like troubling to me. Like I the way I try to untangle that is on the page. It's the only way I know how to do that kind of thing. And you know, you absolutely get the questions of how close is that character to you, and I mean the answer is I don't think particularly satisfying, because it always is like a little bit of both. Like I would be overly coy if I said that it was not, if there was none of me in there. Like of course there is, you know. In fact, like there are even like biographical, like familial details in there. Like Edie has like a big West Indian family that like came over from Trinidad and Tobago to Brooklyn, and like when my family started reading the book, they were like, oh, that's like Uncle Pierre, you know. Like there are things in there that are absolutely I drew from life. But I do think like the gift of fiction is being able to kind of to make that architecture sort of hyperbolic, and that is what that's sort of what I did, though all of the roots are absolutely, they come from me, and there are things that I'm really excited about, or really disturbed by, or you know, topics that I think I will forever be writing toward until I'm bored of them.
I will be very, very quick here, so we hopefully, anyway. But I will say, I always, before I wrote fiction, I always thought that if I was going to write a novel, it would basically just be my life, because I don't have an imagination. Like, I'm never going to write a novel of science fiction or fantasy, because like I don't have like that part of my brain like is absent or doesn't work, or like is just snoozing, or has been snoozing for the past 34 years. But the one, and so basically like I knew that none of the things in the book were like, the events were not mine. All the feelings were mine, but the events were not mine. And so I was sort of not worried about people reading. I was sort of not worried about people about that reading, except, and I feel like we do have to touch on sex, because we're talking about desire. I feel like the reason I am scared of writing sex scenes is that when you're writing a sex scene in fiction, every reader is like, okay, so this is the sex that this person had. And it's a nightmare.
Can I tell you guys a totally inappropriate, like you and some large number of our friends, which is that apparently the thing, my husband found this the other day. He was Googling me, which is also embarrassing, but he said the first thing that came up was Lynn Steger Strong husband. And he was like, oh yeah. Which is just to say, like, I have gotten really funny questions about like what my husband is like. What his response to the book has been. Although what's funny is a lot of the reviews of the book mention like the charming husband or the whatever. And my husband is not that husband, but he is a lovely, charming human. But anyways, it's a funny auto fiction.
Well, they wanted to see like, okay, well, this is the sex that Lynn has. Let's see who she's having it with.
I'm the mom. It's making me sweaty.
Oh my gosh. That's so much vulnerability. I hadn't even thought about that. But Miranda, that's so insightful. Okay, we're gonna go to another question. So E. Madison Shimoda says, Lynn touched upon this a little bit, but traditionally we're taught in writing classes to make sure that characters have clear wants and fears. Do you think there's space for stories about characters who don't know what they want? And if so, how can one write about that journey of discovering her desires with the same kind of live wiry feeling that a traditional hero's journey narrative often has?
Madison was my student, so she knows that you can do a book like that, but also she's already heard my point of view on it. And I actually feel like one of the things I love about both of these books is the way that they show a different path. So I'm gonna step back and let you guys take it over if that's okay.
I would say, I mean, it's interesting because I feel like I take cues from whatever makes me want to keep reading forward, and in some cases that is like screenplay. And so I feel like the idea that the shape of your book has to take that specific shape, which I think is working in the service of trying to keep your audience with you. Because I mean, that's sort of what is underneath that. Establishing the want is this sort of, I feel like Matthew Salaces, I hope I'm saying the name right. It's like, I haven't read enough of it really to talk about it with any real authority, but like writes really beautifully about our sort of traditional ideas of story shape and craft and how deeply male they are. And in some ways I feel like you could probably blow this argument out, apart as I'm trying to put it together easily, but I do think that that is a that sort of disallows for like the messiness of the stories that feel most human, where it's not the want isn't necessarily given to you up front. You don't have the kind of tidy lead, which is good, and which is, giving that information up front. There are some principles that I really admire and do try to execute occasionally, but I do think that the fun is the discovery, both in writing and in the story. And the fun too is in the growth, which actually does sort of relate back to the sort of extremely traditional story trait that we always talk about of change in a character. But I think that if you do not necessarily tether your character to a concrete want, and you leave those options open, you also leave the door open for like a million more avenues of that sort of change. And that is, I think as you write, especially if you're drafting and you're in that first moment where you're kind of just getting your ideas out and trying to figure out the shape of it, being married to the idea of what your character wants and what your character needs might limit you, I think, in a way that might sort of disallow a more like the messiness that is really compelling to me on the page. I don't know if that made sense at all, but I do think that the answer to that is that you don't necessarily have to have that up front. And even visually, I think the stories that the stories that I'm really drawn to are the stories that you're dropped into the middle of someone's day, and it is very much sort of a slice of life where it's more about the texture of their life rather than this sort of like straightforward trajectory. I think that both have merit and both have beauty.
Just one thing, now I'm going to jump, but just one thing that Raven said that feels really worthwhile in this term of like writing a book about a character that doesn't want is this concept of change and where the change has to live within a story, which is to say that like a character and humans, I think this is true of so many humans, lots of humans don't change at all. And lots of humans never figure out what they want. And yet a character who's acting like a 20-year-old when they're 20 is fine. A character who's acting like a 20-year-old when they're 40 is sad. If you write a book where the character doesn't change at all, but actually you see how a 20-year-old who's doing that shit is very different than a 40-year-old, you have change, right? The changes happen to the reader. The character stayed the same, but the reader's been on a journey because the reader understands that, oh, that's actually very uncomfortable and embarrassing and sad for that 40-year-old, but I understand that they, right? Like I understand that they just let time pass and just stayed that sort of calcified specific human. And the same thing kind of, I think, could be true of want, right? Like it's, if you just keep not wanting, there are consequences, right? In the same way that like, if you keep not acting, like another thing that people always tell you in workshop is like, oh, the character acts and reacts. And it's like, yeah, but some people never act. And actually passivity, as we all know, can have extraordinarily violent consequences, right? So the idea that you need action in a novel to have consequence, I also call bullshit, right? Because sometimes it's because the character sat in their house and didn't say anything that the terrible thing happened. And that's a really interesting novel too, I would argue.
Yes.
Yeah, and to go back to something I think you said at the very beginning, Lynn, about, one of the animating sort of themes of this panel being like okay, who is allowed to want and what are they allowed to want? I think we're all interested, well, I won't speak, but I'm interested in writing a character who maybe is not in a position where they're able or willing or brave enough to want a thing. Like, I think a lot of people in their day-to-day lives, to go back to like the slice of life, sort of dropping the reader into someone's life, as Raven was saying, like a lot of people, their days are not governed by this mountaintop goal. Their days are governed by, I need this much money.
Yes.
I need to cook because I need to feed myself. I need to feed my family. Like, I have these tasks that I have to get done at work. There's a real romanticism to the model of, you know, who is the character and what do they want and how are they navigating obstacles in order to climb that mountain to get to that goal. But I think that that is not how many people's lives are lived, and that trying to figure out, like, what are the little choices you make in your daily life and how do they reveal, maybe without the character's knowledge, how do they reveal a kind of undercurrent of desire? That's also very interesting to me.
And how does the dailiness feel like a mountain, right? Like, I mean, how do you shift the reader's relationship to stakes? In what I'm teaching, I talk a lot about like what is your character's explosion, and for some books it's a literal explosion, and for some books it's when the person at the coffee shop doesn't smile at you, right?
Yes.
But what you have to do is teach the readers the terms, right? Such that when the explosion happens, because we read about explosions all the time and don't feel their impact, right? So like, how do you teach a reader the terms so that they understand that actually making dinner was the mountain, and now the character has overcome the mountain, and now actually the book has accomplished something? Or childcare was canceled, which it was today, but you finished everything, you still taught your class. That felt like a mountain. You guys, I have taken a shower today and I am wearing a bra and I had no childcare. Like, that was a mountain.
Yeah.
Sorry to be.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Thank you for saying that out loud, among the other amazing things all of you have said out loud. I wish we had time to get to all of these questions, but I think we can just do one more. So we'll end with this one from Zan McQuaid, who says, you've all talked and written about the vulnerability of writing desire, and they add, Miranda writes so well that scene where her character tries to make herself attractive by making herself seem vulnerable to attack. But Zan's question is, what do you find empowering about writing about desire, especially for women?
I guess I'll start this. I am a person, I am by my nature just terrified of most things. I have always been this way. I move in the world with a great deal of fear. I think less fear the older I get and the more I feel at home in myself and at home in the corner of the world that I have sort of carved out for myself. But I wanted to write about desire specifically from the perspective of someone who is afraid just all the time of what it would mean to ask for what she wants and what it would mean to get what she wants and what it would mean for her to get what she wants and for it not to be enough. So I think that making the book about desire and want and hunger, all of these things, for me it was really about how do you get to a place personally where you are willing to give other people basically the things you're willing to tell other people, like, this is how you can hurt me. You can hurt me by taking away these things that I want, these things that I have that I cherish, or you can hurt me by hearing what I want and saying no.
Yes.
So that for me was a really essential part of the project. This desire to, my own desire as a writer, to sort of figure out like, what is it, what is the work that you have to do to get to the place where you are willing to just daily in the world risk being known by telling people this is what I want, even in really simple, basic ways.
Yeah, I mean, I very much kind of relate to like me as a human person versus like the fiction I write. That like I feel and have a extremely a tumultuous is not exactly the word I want to say, but like a volatile relationship with the with the idea of fear. There are times in which I, as a person, want to lean into it and sort of want to indulge the fantasy that I have, like the power to sort of neutralize it, and that fear is absolutely informed by my understanding of the body I'm in. And when I wrote this book, I wanted to write against that sort of the idea, not just respectability, but of armor, because for me, like that is sort of my like most natural state. The only place that that's not true is on the page. And I don't know why that is, it just is, and that's why I write. But in the book, you know, there are a number of, there are different kinds of armor that Edie sort of will erect depending on like the threat at hand. And sometimes the armor is her body, you know, sometimes the armor is irony, sometimes it's disgust. And I mean, and there's a lot there that I am really struggling to articulate. But the idea of being able to be a Black woman who is allowed to be soft, you know, who is allowed not to, doesn't have to be stoic, like in sort of in the same line of like of that vulnerability that Miranda was just talking about, of making yourself sort of available to be hurt. It's funny because she moves through the world understanding that this is her proximity to death and violence is always very close. But as I wrote her, what felt empowering about that was the idea of softness, was the idea that she would be allowed that vulnerability with sex, with her art, in a world that sort of requires that hardness, in a world that really is specifically requires hardness and yeah, from women, from Black women. So I think that was what was empowering, and that's always what I'm trying to write toward, and what I'm trying to even practice in my own life is that the right the right to be soft. And I don't mean that in like the sort of binary, like, you know, women are soft and men, you know, like I mean open, I mean vulnerable, I mean without armor.
I feel like the one thing I'll add is to connect it to, I feel like what we said at the beginning, which is just this idea of models, and also just the observation that maybe all of us are most willing to be vulnerable on the page and still working on it in the rest of life, which is to say that like something I felt about both of these books and is what I feel most about books I love the most, which is that they feel like offerings. And these books felt like offerings of models in all sorts of different exciting ways. And I think like that idea of being vulnerable on the page to me, and again, I'm like the mom, but like feels maternal in terms of like, I want to put something in the, like, I want to put the things in the world I don't feel quite up to in life. And that's always part of what I'm working towards in fiction. And in that way, I think I'm always working towards more, I mean, I just talked about wearing a bra, but I'm always working towards more vulnerability in fiction than I feel up to in life. and maybe then it'll function as a model. And also like maybe then it helps me, like, to that idea of like working things out in language and things making more sense in language than anything else. Like I think there's something there too. It's like if I can get it right, if I can press on this spruce for 300 pages and survive, maybe I can like make a new friend this week, you know, or whatever.
Look, you can be vulnerable. Your boobs don't have to suffer.
Oh my gosh, what an amazing note to end on. Thank you guys so much for this conversation. I'm so grateful to have spent this hour with you. Thanks everyone who joined us. If you want to watch this again, I'm absolutely going to revisit this whole conversation. You can check Greenlight Bookstore's YouTube channel. We'll have that recording up within the next couple of days. And I dropped the link in the chat if you want to read these books, obviously, and like delve deeper into these authors' amazing worlds. Feel free to do that. Thank you guys so much for your time this evening and for your work.
So wonderful. This is just so beautiful. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.